There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Grave Vale Echoes. Sometimes the past does not simply whisper. It screams. For a noble knight, a night of troubled sleep becomes a terrifying journey into a dream, where a restless spirit seeks a champion to uncover a crime hidden for generations. Sir Philip Harclay was a man made of honor and iron, but even iron can grow weary. For the better part of a decade, the unforgiving sun of the Holy Land had been his roof, and the clang of Saracen steel had been his daily song. He had stood on the ramparts of besieged cities, his armor a furnace under the relentless heat, and had charged across desert sands where the horizon shimmered with mirages and the promise of a bloody death. He had seen courage and cowardice, nobility and barbarism, and had buried more good men than he cared to remember under foreign soil. Now, at long last, the wars were over, and he was returning to an England that felt more like a distant memory than a home. The journey back had been long and arduous. He was a stranger in his own land, a land that had grown softer, greener, and more complicated in his absence. The weight of his weariness was more than just physical. It was a profound fatigue of the soul, a deep, quiet sadness for the years and the friends he had lost. His armor was packed away, but he still felt its immense weight on his shoulders. The man who had left England as a fiery, idealistic youth was returning as a quiet, somber, and deeply tired man. As twilight began to draw its cool, gray veil over the rolling English countryside, he knew he could ride no further. His horse, a faithful veteran of the same campaigns, was stumbling with exhaustion. Ahead, nestled in a quiet valley, a small country inn offered the promise of a meal, a fire, and, most importantly, a bed. It was a humble, whitewashed building, but to a man as bone-weary as Sir Philip, it looked as welcoming as a king's palace. He took a simple room, ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, and spoke little to the innkeeper. He had no energy for pleasantries or for satisfying the locals' curiosity about the grim-faced knight who had appeared out of the dusk. His only desire was for silence and for the oblivion of sleep. The room was small, the bed a simple cot with a straw-stuffed mattress, but after years of sleeping on hard ground or the decks of pitching ships, it felt like the height of luxury. He did not bother to fully undress, merely removing his boots and sword belt before collapsing onto the bed. He expected to fall into the deep, dreamless slumber of the utterly exhausted. But the mind, especially a mind that has witnessed the horrors of war, is not always a peaceful country. As Sir Philip surrendered to the heavy pull of sleep, he did not find the quiet, empty darkness he craved. Instead, his consciousness slipped sideways not into rest, but into a different kind of reality. He was pulled into a dream, but it was a dream with the weight, the texture, and the chilling clarity of a memory. The rough, simple room of the inn dissolved around him. The comforting smell of wood smoke and ale was replaced by the scent of damp stone, wet earth, and a profound, ancient melancholy. He was no longer lying down. He was standing on a patch of uneven, grassy ground, the night air unnaturally cold and still against his face. And before him, rising like a great, dark beast against a starless, ink-black sky, stood Lovell Castle. A jolt of recognition, sharp and poignant, went through him. He knew this place. He had grown up in its shadow, had played within its outer bailey as a boy, long before he had taken up the cross and sailed for foreign lands. He remembered it as a place of strength and pride, its banners snapping in the wind, its halls ringing with the sounds of life and laughter. It had been the home of his dear friend, the original Lord Lovell, a man of great virtue and courage. But the castle that stood before him in this dream was not the place he remembered. This was its ghost. This was its corpse. The proud stone towers were black and menacing, their battlements like the broken teeth of a great skull. No banners flew from its turrets. No warm, welcoming light shone from its windows. The stones themselves seemed to weep a dark, slick moisture, and the great gate was shut, a silent, unwelcoming mouth. The entire structure seemed to be sagging under the immense, invisible weight of a deep and terrible grief. It was a castle that had died, and its soul had stayed behind to haunt the ruins. The landscape of the dream was as wrong as the castle itself. A thick, unnatural fog clung to the ground, a ghostly white shroud that coiled around the base of the castle walls and swirled around Sir Philip's own feet. It was a silent, creeping thing, hiding the foundations of the castle and making it seem as if the entire fortress were floating on a silent, white sea. The fog muffled the world, swallowing all sound until there was only a profound, tomb-like silence. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no cry of a night bird. The world of the dream was dead. Sir Philip stood as if turned to stone, a helpless observer in the landscape of his own mind. He could not move. He could not look away. He was a witness, though he did not yet know what he was meant to be witnessing. He felt a deep, primal unease, a feeling that had nothing to do with his physical weariness and everything to do with the palpable sorrow that saturated the very air of this place. The castle was in mourning. It was grieving for a loss so profound that it had stained the very stones and poisoned the ground it stood on. He remembered the official story, the news that had reached him even in the distant Holy Land. Lord Lovell, his friend, had fallen honorably in battle, and the castle had passed to a distant cousin. It was a sad but simple story, a common fate for a fighting man. But as Sir Philip stood before this spectral, grieving version of the castle, he felt a cold certainty that the story was a lie. Something else had happened here, something terrible, something that had murdered the spirit of this once proud place, leaving only the sorrowful, haunted shell behind. The dream was not a fantasy. It was a message, and he, the weary crusader, had been summoned to hear it. The stage was set, the silence was waiting, and the past was about to make its ghostly entrance. Sir Philip remained a prisoner in his own dream, a statue of flesh and blood in a landscape of spectral stone and sorrowful mist. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, expectant void, a silence that felt like a held breath. The entire dream world, dead castle, the coiling fog, the starless sky seemed to be waiting. The air itself was taut with a palpable, humming tension, the kind of stillness that precedes a lightning strike or the moment before a headsman's axe falls. He was standing on the precipice of a revelation, and he felt a profound, instinctual dread about what that revelation might be. Then, the silence was not just broken, it was shattered. From the highest turret of the phantom castle, a sound erupted. It was the tolling of a great bell. Dong. The sound was unlike any he had ever heard. It was not the clear, bright chime of a village church calling the faithful to prayer. This was a sound of immense weight and profound, soul-deep melancholy. It was a sound coated in the rust of centuries and the dust of the tomb. It did not ring out so much as it fell from the black sky, a sonic blow that struck the dream world and sent slow, ponderous waves of vibration radiating out through the mist. Sir Philip felt the sound not just in his ears, but as a deep, shuddering pulse in his chest, a single mighty heartbeat that seemed to momentarily stop his own. An agonizing, silent pause followed, the echo of the first toll fading into the oppressive quiet. Then it came again. Dong. The second toll was even deeper, even sadder than the first. It seemed to speak of loss, of betrayal, of a grief so ancient it had become a part of the natural order of this place. This was a funeral bell, tolling for a death that had never been properly mourned. With each chime, the dream felt more real, its horrifying details becoming sharper, more defined. This was a ritual, a supernatural ceremony, and the tolling of the bell was its overture. He found himself counting instinctively, a helpless participant in the countdown. Dong. 3. The unnatural fog at his feet seemed to thicken, its cold, damp tendrils coiling around his legs, trying to root him to the spot. Dong. 4. He noticed that the dark, weeping stains on the castle walls seemed to glisten, as if the stones themselves were shedding fresh tears with each note of the lament. The bell tolled on, each note a hammer blow against the silence, each one a step deeper into the heart of the nightmare. This was the midnight summons. The dream was not just showing him a place. It was calling him to it. He was not just an observer. He was being summoned as a witness. 9, 10, 11. The tolls came faster now, more insistent, a frantic, desperate rhythm that spoke of an urgent, long overdue message. The very air grew colder, and a new, chilling sensation washed over him. He felt the unmistakable, prickling feeling of being watched. He was not alone in this desolate landscape. Unseen eyes were upon him, peering out from the black, vacant arrow slits of the castle walls, watching him from the swirling depths of the fog. The dead were aware of his presence, and they were waiting for him. Yong. The 12th and final toll was a cataclysm of sound, a final, deafening pronouncement that shook the very foundations of the dream. As its last, mournful vibration finally died away, leaving a silence that was somehow even more profound than before, the true purpose of the summons was revealed. The great oak doors of Lovell Castle, doors that were thick enough to withstand a siege and bound with immense straps of black iron, began to move. They did not creak or groan. They swung inward with a slow, silent, and utterly inexorable motion, as if pulled by a force that knew nothing of friction or the weight of ages. They opened not onto a welcoming, firelit hall, but onto a chasm of pure, impenetrable darkness. It was not simply a dark room. It was a solid, tangible blackness, a presence in its own right. It was a darkness that seemed to be breathing, to be alive. It swirled and eddied at the threshold, a living entity that promised untold horrors within its depths. The open doorway was not an entrance. It was a wound in the side of the castle, and it was bleeding darkness into the world. It was an invitation to the abyss. And from that open wound, a new sensation flowed out to meet him. It was a wave of palpable, grave-like cold. A chill so profound and so unnatural that it made the cold of the foggy night air feel like a summer's warmth. This was the cold of a place that had been sealed for centuries. The cold of deep, forgotten cellars. The cold of a desecrated tomb. It washed over him, and with it came the scent of the grave. Damp earth, crumbling stone, and the faint, dry, papery smell of ancient, undisturbed death. He stood frozen, his knightly courage, his years of facing down mortal enemies, proving to be an utterly useless defense against the supernatural assault. He was terrified, but his terror was overridden by a new, irresistible force. He felt a pull, a gentle but absolute compulsion to move forward. It was as if invisible hands had taken hold of him, drawing him out of the foggy field and towards the open, waiting doors of the dead castle. He tried to resist, to plant his feet, to fight against this unseen current. But his body would no longer obey him. His legs began to move, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the castle. He was a pawn, being moved onto a ghostly chessboard by a player he could not see. He was no longer in control of his own dream, if it had ever been his own dream at all. He was an actor, being forced onto a dark stage to play a part he had not chosen and did not understand. With each step he took, the details of the castle grew clearer, more menacing. He saw the portcullis, its iron teeth rusted and frozen in the up position. He saw the murder holes in the archway above the gate, dark mouths that had once rained down boiling oil and now seemed to be gaping in a silent, eternal scream. The feeling of being watched intensified. The unseen eyes of the castle's ghostly inhabitants now fixed upon him with a desperate, pleading intensity. He reached the threshold, the boundary between the misty dream world and the solid, breathing darkness of the castle's interior. The grave cold intensified, a final, chilling embrace. He paused for a single, heart-stopping moment, a living man on the edge of a dead world. Then, the inexorable pull won. He took the final step, crossing from the world he knew into the waiting, whispering darkness of Lovell Castle. The great doors, their purpose fulfilled, swung silently shut behind him, sealing him inside, plunging him into an absolute blackness, alone with the ghosts of a forgotten crime. The moment the great oak doors swung shut behind Sir Philip, the world dissolved into an absolute and profound blackness. The faint, spectral light of the dream world was gone, and with it all sense of direction and space. He was adrift in a void, the only sensations the biting, grave-like cold on his skin and the hard, stone floor beneath his feet. The silence, too, had changed. Outside, it had been an expectant, outdoor silence. Here, inside the sealed walls of the castle, it was a thick, suffocating, and ancient silence, the silence of a place that has not heard a living voice for centuries. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the wall of his chest. He was a knight, a man of action, but in this impenetrable darkness, all action was useless. He was blind, helpless, a prisoner in a fortress of ghosts. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, rough-hewn stone of the wall beside him, the only anchor in his disorienting black world. Then a light began to grow. It did not appear suddenly. It was a slow, gradual coalescing, a faint, silvery luminescence that seemed to be born from the very air in the center of the vast, dark space. It grew slowly, pushing back the oppressive blackness, revealing the immense, cavernous dimensions of the great hall of Lovell Castle. But this was not the warm, welcoming hall he remembered from his youth. This was its sad, spectral echo. The light was a cold, sterile silver, like moonlight seen through ice, and it revealed a scene of profound decay and neglect. Great, tattered banners, their vibrant colors faded to ghostly pastels, hung like funeral shrouds from the high, vaulted ceiling, which was draped in thick, web-like tapestries of cobwebs. A massive, long dining table, large enough to seat 100 knights, was covered in a thick, gray blanket of dust, a silent testament to feasts that would never be held again. The air was thick with the smell of damp, rot, and the dry, papery scent of time itself. But it was not the decay that held Sir Philip's attention. It was the source of the light. In the very center of the hall, the silvery luminescence was gathering, concentrating, weaving itself into a form. It was a slow, agonizing process, as if the spirit were having to draw on all the latent sorrow and memory of the castle just to manifest itself. A pillar of shimmering, translucent light began to take on a human shape, the tall, proud silhouette of a man. Sir Philip watched, frozen in a state of awe and terror, as the figure solidified. It was not a grotesque or horrifying apparition. It was a figure of immense and tragic nobility. The spirit was that of a man in his prime, dressed in the fine but simple attire of a nobleman. But his form was not solid. It was woven from moonlight and memory, a translucent, shimmering effigy through which Sir Philip could see the faint outlines of the decaying hall behind him. Then the figure turned its head, and Sir Philip's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. He had seen it in portraits, had known it in life. It was the face of his friend, his brother-in-arms, the true master of this castle, Lord Lovell. But the face was a mask of tragedy. The proud, kind eyes that he remembered were now filled with a profound, boundless, and centuries-old grief. The strong, firm mouth was set in a line of eternal, silent sorrow. This was not a peaceful spirit. This was a soul in torment, a soul that had been denied its rest, chained to the scene of its own suffering. The ghost of Lord Lovell looked at Sir Philip, and in its spectral eyes, there was a flash of recognition. It was a look that said, "You, at last. I have been waiting." There was no surprise, only a deep, weary acknowledgement. Sir Philip was not here by chance. He had been chosen. He had been summoned. The ghost did not speak. The silence in the hall remained absolute, unbroken, and the silence was more terrifying, more potent, than any ghostly wail could ever have been. It spoke of a sorrow too deep for words, a betrayal so profound it had stolen the very voice of the spirit. The ghost's communication was to be one of gesture, of pure, silent intent. Slowly, with a grace that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, the phantom raised its right arm. The arm was as translucent as the rest of its body, a shimmering limb of captured moonlight. Its hand formed a point, a single spectral finger extending with a clear, deliberate purpose. Sir Philip braced himself, expecting the ghost to point at him, or perhaps at the high table or at the main doors. But it did not. The ghostly finger pointed downwards. It pointed toward a dark, arched doorway at the far end of the hall, a doorway that Sir Philip knew led to the winding stone staircase that descended into the castle's undercroft of the cellars, the storerooms, and, deepest of all, the family crypt. The silent command was unmistakable. "Follow me. The truth is not here in the world of the living. It is down there, in the dark, in the domain of the dead." The ghost then began to move. It did not walk. It glided. It drifted across the dusty stone floor, its feet making no sound, its translucent form leaving no disturbance in the thick, ancient dust. It moved with a slow, sorrowful, and inexorable purpose, a silent guide on a journey into the abyss. It reached the dark, arched doorway and paused, turning its head one last time to look at Sir Philip, its eyes filled with a desperate, pleading urgency. Then, it passed through the doorway and was swallowed by the darkness beyond. A choice, or the illusion of one, lay before Sir Philip. He could stay here in the relative, albeit spectral, light of the great hall, or he could follow the spirit of his murdered friend into the suffocating, unknown darkness below. But it was not a real choice. The same inexorable pull that had drawn him into the castle now compelled him to follow. His body moved, his feet carrying him across the dusty floor, his own footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the vast, silent space. He reached the doorway and peered down the stairwell. A wave of intense, subterranean cold washed over him, a cold that smelled of damp earth, of mildew, of wine that had turned to vinegar in forgotten barrels. The darkness below was absolute. The ghost was not lighting the way. It was waiting for him, somewhere down there in the black. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, Sir Philip began his descent. The stone steps were slick with a fine, slimy dampness, and he had to place a hand on the cold, rough wall to steady himself. The air grew colder, heavier with every step he took. He was leaving the world behind, descending into the very foundations of the castle, into its secret, hidden places. The staircase was a long, winding spiral that seemed to go on forever. He passed by arched doorways that led to storerooms, their heavy, iron-banded doors sealed shut, their contents long since turned to dust and rot. He passed by a dark, foreboding passageway that he knew led to the castle's dungeons, a place of unimaginable misery. The ghost was leading him past all of these, deeper and deeper still. Finally, the staircase opened out into a long, low-ceilinged corridor, its floor made of damp, packed earth. The air here was thick with the smell of the grave. This was the castle's deepest level. This was the domain of the dead. At the far end of the corridor, he could see a faint, silvery light, the ghost, waiting for him. He walked the length of the corridor, his boots squelching softly in the damp earth. He reached the end and found himself in a small, vaulted antechamber. Here, the ghost of Lord Lovell stood before a great, iron-bound door, the entrance to the main family crypt. But again, the spirit did not seem interested in this place. It glided past the main entrance, towards a section of the wall that appeared to be solid, unadorned stone. It paused there, turning to face Sir Philip, its expression now one of intense, almost painful concentration. This journey was almost at an end. The secret was close, and as Sir Philip watched, the ghost raised its translucent hand and passed it directly through the solid stone wall, beckoning him one last time into the final, hidden chamber of the nightmare. The sight of the ghost's hand passing through solid stone should have been the most shocking moment of the night, yet Sir Philip felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He was so far beyond the boundaries of the natural world now that the impossible had become the new reality. The ghost was not bound by the laws of physics, and in this dream world, neither, it seemed, was he. The spectral figure of his friend, Lord Lovell, glided through the wall and vanished, leaving behind only the cold, damp stone and an unspoken, urgent command to follow. Sir Philip hesitated for only a heartbeat. He had been led this far, drawn by an invisible thread of sorrow and purpose. To turn back now was unthinkable. Steeling himself, he took a deep breath of the cold, earthy air and stepped forward, toward the wall. He closed his eyes, expecting the jarring, painful impact of his body against solid rock. But there was no impact. He felt a sensation of profound, dizzying cold, a brief, disorienting plunge through a medium that was thicker than air but far less solid than stone. It was like diving into ice-cold water. Then the sensation passed. He opened his eyes and found himself standing in a new space. He was in a small, hidden chamber, a secret room that had been walled up and forgotten for centuries. The air in here was utterly stagnant, thick with the dust of ages and the dry, suffocating scent of a place that had been hermetically sealed. The walls were of rough, undressed stone, and the low, vaulted ceiling was shrouded in thick, ghostly white blankets of cobwebs that hung down like funeral shrouds. There was no entrance, no doorway save for the one he had just impossibly passed through. This was a place that was never meant to be found. It was a purpose-built tomb, a chamber designed not to honor the dead, but to hide them. The ghost of Lord Lovell was waiting for him in the center of the room, its translucent form the only source of the faint, silvery light. Its grief, which had been a constant, sorrowful aura, was now sharpened, focused into a point of raw, agonizing intensity. The spirit's long, sorrowful journey was at its end. This small, forgotten room was the heart of its torment. In the center of the chamber, dominating the small space, was a single, plain stone sarcophagus. It was not the grand, ornate tomb that would have been in the main family crypt. This was a simple, unadorned stone box, its surface rough and devoid of any inscription. It was an anonymous grave for a forgotten soul, and it was desecrated. The heavy stone lid was not in place. It had been pushed crudely aside, canted at an angle, leaving the interior of the sarcophagus gaping open like a screaming mouth. Sir Philip approached it slowly, his dread mounting with every step. He peered over the edge and into the dark interior, and he saw nothing. The tomb was empty. It was filled with nothing but a thick layer of gray, century-old dust, a few brittle, yellowed leaves that must have blown in before it was sealed, and the intricate, sprawling latticework of 1,000 generations of spiders. There was no body, no bones, no remnant of the person who was meant to be interred here. The sight of the empty tomb was somehow more horrifying than if it had contained a corpse. It spoke of a crime that was not just murder, but a profound and deliberate act of erasure. The ghost of Lord Lovell glided to a position beside the empty sarcophagus. It did not look down into the vacant tomb. Its spectral gaze was fixed on Sir Philip, its eyes burning with a desperate, silent urgency. The emptiness of the tomb was part of the story, but it was not the final chapter. The spirit seemed to be pleading with him, begging him to understand, to look deeper. Then, with a movement that was filled with all the pain and rage of its long, unjust undeath, the ghost raised its shimmering spectral arm. The finger, a thing of condensed moonlight and sorrow, was trembling violently, pointed. But it was not pointing at the empty sarcophagus. It was not pointing at Sir Philip. It was pointing at the sheer stone wall directly behind the tomb. Sir Philip stared, his mind racing. The wall? It was just a wall, a seamless surface of rough, gray stone, identical to the others. He saw nothing. He stepped closer, his own eyes scanning the surface, looking for a crack, a seam, a hidden switch. Was this another illusion? Another ghostly doorway? The phantom's pointing finger grew more insistent, its trembling more violent. A faint, silent, psychic scream of frustration and desperation seemed to emanate from it. Look closer. See what I see. And as Sir Philip continued to stare at the wall, focusing his entire will on it, the stone began to change. It was not a physical change. The rock did not move or dissolve. It was a change in his perception, a supernatural vision being projected directly from the ghost's tortured consciousness into his own. The solid stone wall became transparent. It was like looking through a pane of dusty, distorted glass. He could still see the surface of the rock, but he could now also see through it into the space beyond. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Behind the wall, carved into the very heart of the castle's foundation, was a small, hidden compartment. It was a secret niche, a hollowed-out space no larger than a cupboard. It was not a grand chamber or a hidden treasury. It was a crude, dark, and ignominious hole. And it was not empty. Huddled in a pathetic, disordered pile at the bottom of the secret compartment were the remains of a human being. A skeleton, its bones stained dark brown from the dampness of the stone. Its form long since collapsed into a heap of disconnected femurs, ribs, and vertebrae. A skull, its jaw agape in a silent, eternal scream, lay on its side, its empty eye sockets staring into the endless, suffocating darkness of its hidden prison. And lying amidst the pile of bones, its metal blade almost completely consumed by a deep, red rust, was a dagger. A simple, stiletto-style dagger, its hilt plain and unadorned. It was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of assassination. The truth, in all its stark, brutal, and horrifying clarity, crashed down upon Sir Philip with the force of a physical blow. The official story, the one that had been told for a generation, was a lie. Lord Lovell, his friend, had not died an honorable death in a foreign war. The grand, empty tomb in the main crypt was a sham, a hollow monument to a lie. He had been murdered. He had been stabbed in the back, here, in his own home, in the deepest, most secret part of his own castle. And his body had not been laid to rest. It had been unceremoniously dumped, stripped of its armor and identity, and sealed away in this crude, hidden hole, left to rot in the dark like a diseased animal. The empty sarcophagus in this chamber was a decoy, a false bottom, a final, cynical act of misdirection. The crime was so profound, so monstrous, that it took his breath away. This was not just a murder. It was a complete and utter erasure of a man's existence. It was a crime against his name, his honor, his family, and his God. And the ghost that stood beside him was not just the spirit of a murdered man. It was the spirit of a man whose very memory had been desecrated, whose legacy had been stolen by the man who had killed him. The vision held for a moment longer, the ghost forcing him to bear witness, to absorb every horrific detail: the pile of dusty bones, the screaming skull, the rusty dagger. This was the secret. This was the source of the castle's grief. This was the crime that had poisoned the very stones. Then, having finally shown its truth to a living soul, the ghost's purpose seemed to be fulfilled. The vision of the hidden crypt shattered like breaking glass. The transparent wall became solid stone once more. The silvery light in the chamber began to flicker and fade, the ghost's form wavering, its energy spent. The last thing Sir Philip saw before the dream dissolved completely was the face of his friend, Lord Lovell. The profound, agonizing grief in its eyes was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. A single, spectral tear, a drop of captured moonlight, rolled down its translucent cheek, and in its eyes, there was a faint, new glimmer. It was not joy. It was not peace. It was a flicker of hope. The hope of a wronged soul who had, at long last, found its champion. Then, the chamber, the ghost, and the entire dream world vanished, and Sir Philip was hurled back into his own body with a violent, shuddering gasp. Sir Philip awoke with a violent, convulsive gasp that was more of a choked scream. He lurched upright in the narrow cot, his body rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs with the frantic, irregular rhythm of a war drum. The rough, woolen blanket felt coarse and alien against his skin. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, he didn't know where he was. The horrifying images from the dream were still seared onto the inside of his eyelids, more real and vivid than the dark, simple room around him. He could still feel the profound, grave-like cold of the hidden chamber in his bones. He could still smell the thick, ancient dust and the damp decay of the secret tomb. He could still see the pile of brown, broken bones and the rusty dagger. He flung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold, rough-hewn floorboards with a thud. He was drenched in a cold, clammy sweat, his nightshirt clinging to his skin. He was trembling, not with the gentle shivers of a man who is cold, but with the deep, uncontrollable tremors of a man who has suffered a profound shock to his very soul. He stumbled to the small, grimy window of the inn room and pushed aside the simple curtain. Outside, the first, faint, Gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, painting the underside of the dark clouds with a pale, ethereal glow. The world was real. The quiet, rolling English countryside, the distant silhouette of the trees, the low stone wall that bordered the inn's property, it was all solid, mundane, and blessedly normal. The nightmare was over. He was awake. But as he stood there, his breath fogging the cool glass of the windowpane, he knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as the rising of the sun, that it had not been just a dream. It was too real, too detailed, too coherent. Nightmares born of an exhausted mind or a troubled conscience were chaotic, fragmented things. They were a maelstrom of disconnected fears and anxieties. This had been different. This had been a narrative, a story, told with a clear, deliberate, and desperate purpose. It had a beginning, a middle, and a horrifying, revelatory end. It was not a fantasy his mind had concocted. It was a memory that had been forced upon him. It was a message, delivered across the great, silent chasm of death. He was a knight, a man who had lived his life by a strict code of honor, justice, and duty. He had prayed to his God for guidance on the eve of battle, but he had never been a man given to mystical fancies or supernatural visions. He was a pragmatist, a soldier who believed in the evidence of his own eyes and the strength of his own sword arm. And yet, he could not deny the truth of what he had experienced. The spirit of his murdered friend, Lord Lovell, had reached out from its tormented, unquiet grave and had chosen him. The question that now faced him was not whether the dream had been real, but what it meant. Was it simply a vision, a horrifying glimpse into a past crime, a truth revealed to him for his own knowledge? Was he meant to simply carry this terrible secret with him, a silent, grieving witness to his friend's tragic fate? No, he knew instinctively that was not the case. The look in the ghost's eyes at the very end, that faint, new glimmer of hope, told him everything. This was not just a vision, it was a mandate. It was a sacred charge, a holy quest laid at his feet by a soul that could not find peace. He was not meant to be a passive observer. He was meant to be an instrument of vengeance and of justice. The weariness that had weighed so heavily on him just hours before was gone, burned away by the cold, righteous fire that now kindled in his heart. The aimless, melancholy knight who had been returning to a home he no longer recognized had been given a new and terrible purpose. His wanderings were over. He now had a direction, a mission. His path led back to Lovell Castle. Not the spectral, grieving castle of his dream, but the real, physical castle of stone and timber that stood just a few miles from this very inn. A castle that was now occupied by another man, the distant cousin who had inherited the title and the lands. A man who now seemed far more than just a lucky heir. A man who was now the prime suspect in a century-old murder. A cold, hard logic, the mind of the soldier and strategist, began to take over. The ghost had shown him the truth, but a ghost's testimony would not stand in any court of law. He could not simply ride to the castle and accuse the new Lord Lovell of being the descendant of a murderer and a usurper. He needed proof. Hard, tangible, physical proof that he could present to the world of the living. The proof lay where the ghost had shown him. It was in that hidden, walled-up chamber, deep in the foundations of the castle. The proof was in the pile of forgotten bones and the rusty dagger. He had to get back into that castle. He had to find that secret room. He had to bring that terrible, hidden truth out into the light. The challenges were immense. He was a single man against a powerful, established family. He would be seen as a madman, a troublemaker chasing fantasies. The new Lord Lovell would not simply allow him to start tearing down the walls of his ancestral home based on a nightmare. He would be met with resistance, with ridicule, and, if the family had inherited even a fraction of their ancestors' ruthlessness, with violence. But Sir Philip felt no fear. The terror of the dream had been replaced by a grim, unshakable resolve. He had faced down Saracen armies. He had charged into the teeth of almost certain death. He would not be deterred by the scorn of lesser men. He had been given a sacred trust by his murdered friend, and he would not fail. He turned from the window, his mind clear, his purpose set. He was no longer just Sir Philip Harclay, the weary crusader. He was now the champion of a restless spirit, the bearer of a terrible truth. His war had not ended in the Holy Land. A new, more personal, and perhaps far more dangerous war was about to begin, right here, in the green and pleasant lands of England. He began to dress, not in the simple traveling clothes of a man seeking peace, but in the mindset of a man preparing for battle. The dead of Lovell Castle had cried out for justice, and Sir Philip Harclay, their chosen knight, was going to answer. Sir Philip is no longer just a weary soldier returning home. He is now the keeper of a terrible secret, tasked by a ghost with exposing a murderer and restoring a stolen legacy. The dead have spoken, and he must answer. What exactly is hidden in that secret crypt? And what is the spirit of Lord Lovell truly seeking from Sir Philip? Let us know what you think below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.